In part 1, we find out that Shin's close friend, Sita William, is also a vampire and says he is Shin's long-lost brother. Now, let's continue. As Shin, Situ and Milan are waiting for the dawn, Miss Mu sets fire to the surrounding fields, forcing the trio to flee to the nearest railway track, where they wait for the Asia Express. As the train approaches, they manage to board it just in time. However, Lee informs the next station to stop the train and apprehend the fugitive. Anticipating this, Shen, Milan, and Situ jump off the train before it reaches the station, disappearing into the wilderness. Back in the city, Superintendent Chi is furious with Lee for letting Shin escape and has him arrested. Guixing, loyal to Lee, seeks out Miss Jean and pleads with her to help Lee, emphasizing that Lee genuinely cares for her despite his rough demeanor. Moved by Guixing's words, Miss Jean meets with Superintendent Chi and begs for Lee's release. Reluctantly, Chi agrees, but he warns Lee that he has only one chance left to redeem himself. Ashamed yet grateful, Lee silently vows to confront Shen and Miss Mu with renewed determination. Lee, now suspended from his duties, entrusts Guixing to continue the investigation into Shen's whereabouts. Despite his suspension, Lee is determined to use his own means to track Shen down. Meanwhile, Shen and Milan arrive at the astrologer Mr. Mo's house, where they seek refuge. While Situ takes care of Milan, Shen confides in Mr. Mu about his recent discovery of his long-lost brother, Situ. However, Shen remains conflicted about whether this revelation is a blessing or a curse. When Shen and Situ confront each other later, the tension explodes. Shen angrily asks Situ why he played hide-and-seek with him for 3 years, especially when Shen had been desperately searching for him. Situ admits he feared Shen would seek revenge and end their friendship if he discovered the truth. Shen's anger flares, and the two engage in a heated fight. To Shen's surprise, Situ proves stronger than him, and Shen eventually gives up, realizing he can't win. Upon their return, Mr. Mu scolds them for their reckless behavior, reminding them of their age and responsibilities. During dinner, Shen asks Situ how he became like them. Situ recounts the horrific night when the Shen family tried to burn him and his mother alive. His mother killed everyone, including Shen, but Situ begged her to save Shen. In desperation, she used a mysterious stone to bring Shen back to life, and then she and Situ left the town. Now, Situ hopes to mend their bond and be brothers again. However, Shen feels deeply betrayed by Situ's secrecy and orders him to leave. Heartbroken, Situ retreats to a nearby town and meets with Miss Jean. He shares his sorrow, explaining how his closest friend now feels betrayed and has cut ties with him. Miss Jean, understanding both sides, tells Situ that Shen likely valued him immensely, and that's why the betrayal hurt so much. Back at Mr. Mo's house, Milan awakens with her wounds healed. Shen lovingly prepares chicken soup for her and goes out to buy rice cake. While shopping, he overhears from a vendor that the Haidong police are patrolling the area, searching for 3 fugitives. Alarmed, Shen returns and decides to move locations immediately to ensure Milan's safety. Mr. Mu bids them farewell, advising Shen to seek the legendary blood amber stone, a cure for his condition. After traveling for some time, Shen and Milan arrive at the ancestral Shen residence, where an old friend of Shen guards the property. The house offers temporary refuge, but danger looms nearby. Lee, in the meantime, strikes a deal with Miss Mu, revealing Shen's location. In exchange, Lee requests her shadow warriors to aid in capturing Shen. Miss Mu agrees, and the plan is set in motion. The next morning, Shen and Milan visit the family graveyard to search for the blood amber stone. Shen digs up his own grave, where his human body was buried, and finds the stone hidden there. Just as Milan notices a group of men approaching, she tries to warn Shen, but he is too engrossed in the discovery to hear her. Lee and his men arrive, and Lee fires a shot at Shen. Milan throws herself in front of Shen, taking the bullet. Enraged, Shen unleashes his fury, killing the soldiers and Miss Mu's shadow warriors. Lee barely escapes with his life. Returning to Milan, Shen finds her gravely injured but still smiling, content to have spent her final moments with him. Refusing to lose her, Shen uses the blood amber stone and his own blood to revive her. Shen carries Milan back to Haidong City, where she sleeps for 3 days. When she finally wakes up, she is astonished to find her blindness has been cured. For the first time, she can see her surroundings. Wandering outside her room, she finds him decorating the house with flowers. Overwhelmed with joy, she rushes to him and hugs him tightly. Shen, noticing her restored vision, feels immense relief and happiness. Milan takes a bath for the first time by herself, marveling at her reflection in the mirror, a sight she has never seen before. Once ready, she goes to meet Shen, her heart filled with gratitude and a newfound sense of hope for their future. Lee, terrified after shooting at Milan and fearing Shen's wrath, turns to Superintendent Chi for protection. Meanwhile, Guixing checks if Milan is alive and finds her perfectly fine, sitting outside Shen's mansion the next morning. He informs Li, who becomes even more paranoid. At Shen's mansion, Shen and Milan enjoy their time together, while Li desperately seeks help. He convinces Miss Jean to arrange a meeting with Sidhu, hoping to reconcile with Shen before Shen retaliates. Sidhu, however, meets Shen first, but Shen, tired of their association, refuses to listen. Sidhu spots Milan and is happy to see her healthy and able to see, but he realizes Shen is cutting ties with him, likely because Milan is now devoted to Shen. Later, Li interrupts Sidhu and Miss Jean on a date, pleading with Sidhu to mediate with Shen. Sidhu refuses, saying his friendship with Shen is over. Desperate, Li offers money, and Sidhu agrees to pass a peace message to Shen. After leaving, Shen unexpectedly meets Li at the restaurant. Terrified, Li begs for forgiveness and pledges loyalty, but Shen has other plans. When Li gains consciousness, he finds himself locked in a room with Shen. Li starts to beg for mercy, claiming that he never intended to harm Shen or high people, but Shen isn't moved by his fake cry. After locking Li inside the room, he investigates Li's house. Shen finds a passbook with very low bank balance, indicating Li isn't corrupt but checks his office for further details. He discovers that Superintendent Chi exploited Li for personal gain and plans to expose this in the newspaper. Shen warns Li that this revelation could make him a target for Chi. As the news about Chi's frauds become public, Chi starts looking for Li, Guixing running away from Chi's men. Guixing suspects Shen's involvement in abducting Li and asks Miss Jean for help. She calls Shen's mansion, where Milan answers and claims to be Shen's sister. Miss Jean demands Shen return her call. Later, Guixing is captured by Chi's men. Meanwhile, Milan and Shen run into Miss Jean and Sidhu while shopping. Miss Jean accuses Shen of kidnapping Li. Shen denies it, and a heated argument leads to Milan slapping Miss Jean when she hits Shen. This escalates into a public fight, but Shen assures Miss Jean that Li is likely hiding and will return once the issue with Chi is resolved. Shen scolds Milan for her outburst, but she explains she lost her temper because she has faced bullying all her life and won't tolerate anyone hurting Shen. Miss Jean, upset with Sidhu, starts avoiding him. Frustrated, Sidhu visits Shen, urging him to release Li so Miss Jean can stop worrying and they can move on. Shen finally agrees. However, when Shen checks on Li, he hears him singing a familiar song. Shen suspects a connection to his past and learns that Li blames him for his sister's death. Despite Li's apologies and pleas, Shen senses Li's malice and refuses to release him. Li, losing his sanity in captivity, discovers a water-damaged wall and escapes. He hides in Miss Jin's house, injured and traumatized, claiming Shen tortured him. Miss Jean cares for him and suggests leaving Haidong for his safety, but Li, haunted by nightmares, refuses. The next morning, Sidhu visits Miss Jean, but her maid denies him entry, saying she's not home. Sidhu goes to Shen, who shows no interest in Sidhu's problems. Instead, Shen gives him a blood amber stone and shares its story. Centuries ago, 3 powerful families gained their strength from 3 meteorite shards with unique abilities. And other 2 stones are with Miss Mu, the Fantasy Stone, and the Profound Stone. Before addressing Miss Mu, Sidhu asks Shen for advice on how to fix his relationship with Miss Jean. Shen suggests that Miss Jean is purposefully avoiding him and advises him to keep calling her until she responds. Meanwhile, Li learns that Sidhu is reaching out to Miss Jean. He manipulates the situation, convincing Miss Jean to invite Sidhu over. When Sidhu visits Miss Jin's house, Li appears and privately asks Sidhu to deliver a message to Superintendent Chi in exchange for helping capture Shen. Li promises to help Sidhu win over Miss Jean. Though confused, Sidhu agrees, believing Li's claims that he won't harm Shen. Elsewhere, Miss Mu uncovers Shen's connection to the Wei family and recalls that her ancestors once fought the Wei family for possession of the Blood Amber Stone. Convinced that Shen now holds the stone, she starts plotting against him. Sidhu later meets Shen, who reveals plans to leave town for good. Sidhu tries to persuade him to surrender to Superintendent Chi and Li, arguing that Li promised to make Miss Jean fall in love with him. Shen calls Sidhu naive, explaining that Miss Jean already loves Li. However, when Sidhu pleads like a younger brother, Shen reluctantly agrees to help, but only if Sidhu meets with Miss Mu. Milan, worried for Shen's safety, seeks Sidhu's guidance on how to help. Sidhu suggests they eliminate both Miss Mu and Superintendent Chi to solve the ongoing problems. Shen overhears this plan and reprimands Milan for her recent odd behavior, assigning her a punishment to write a 40-page essay. Milan, however, has her own plans. That night, Superintendent Chi's car encounters strange phenomena, a crow perched on the vehicle and an eerie white figure nearby. Furious, Chi fires his gun multiple times. It is later revealed that Milan was behind the scare tactic, but she gets injured in the process. The next morning, while Milan talks to the crow, Shen notices bloodstains on her clothes but says nothing. Later, she admits she spent the night scaring Superintendent Chi, inspired by how Shen once frightened her own mother. Shen, surprisingly, doesn't get angry. While he appreciates her intent, he warns her to be cautious as Chi is a dangerous man. Meanwhile, Situ meets Superintendent Chi and informs him that Shin kidnapped Lee and exposed Chi's corruption to the media. He suggests meeting Lee at the Ji mansion, claiming they have a plan to capture Shin. Superintendent Chi is skeptical of Situ's loyalty due to his ties with Shin, even as Situ insists on his plan. Meanwhile, Miss Jean grows worried about Lee and spends time with him. During their conversation, Lee suggests she marry Situ and offers to repay her kindness with a dowry. Angered by his words, Miss Jean kisses him for the first time after holding back for so long. Though Lee initially tries to resist, Miss Jean doesn't let him leave, and he ultimately gives in, admitting his own long-buried feelings for her. The next morning, Lee leaves the house, promising to return after he has dealt with Shen. However, his meeting with Superintendent Chi leads to a more sinister plan. Lee decides to trap Shen in a mine and force him to sign a confession stating the accusations against Chi and Lee were false. Afterward, Lee plans to eliminate Situ in order to marry Miss Jean and live a peaceful life ahead, but what he doesn't know that Superintendent Chi has his own plan for them. Chi initially plans to trap Shen in a mine with Lee's help, and force him to sign a confession stating the accusations against Chi were false. Afterward, Chi plans to eliminate Shen, Situ, and Lee along with Miss Mu, whom Chi sees as a growing threat. Milan grows increasingly worried about Shin and questions why he would allow himself to be captured. Shin reassures her that, as the head of the household, he must ensure the happiness of others. He promises her he will return and asks her to trust him. Shin and Situ are lured to the mine by Lee, who pretends to be on their side, claiming he's only following Chi's orders to protect himself. Inside the mine, Lee convinces Shen to sign a confession, but Shen cleverly limits it to clearing Lee's name without exonerating Chi of his crimes. This infuriates Chi, but Lee pacifies him by promising to use Miss Mu's influence to get what they need. Meanwhile, Shen's manager discovers that Milan has run away from the mansion. Milan, tracking Lee and Guixing, overhears their plan to harm Shen. She quickly returns home to devise a rescue plan, leaving the blood amber stone behind for safekeeping. The next morning, she sets out to stop Lee and Guixing. Elsewhere, Superintendent Chi meets with Miss Mu under the pretense of practicing shooting. However, he attempts to kill her, only to find his gun has been tampered with. Miss Mu reveals she has bought out his men, and her assistant Wu executes Chi instead. When Li and Guixing arrive at the mine, Milan confronts them. She enters the mine and rescues Shen and Situ, who had been waiting for Miss Mu to arrive, unaware of the recent turn of events. However, the situation takes a dangerous turn as Chi's men, now working under Miss Mu, prepare to ambush them. Guixing overhears the new plan and warns Li. Shen, Situ, and the others attempt to escape the mine, but soldiers armed with flamethrowers pursue them. Shen acts heroically, saving Li and Situ while Milan helps them find an alternate route out. Guixing stays behind to buy them time but manages to catch up with the group later. The group narrowly escapes, but they now face an uncertain future as their enemies close in. Seeing Situ badly injured enrages Shen, who confronts Li. Li insists he had no idea Miss Mu planned to betray them, though Shen remains skeptical. Guixing volunteers to find a safe exit, while Li searches for medicine to help Situ. As Miss Mu and her soldiers arrive at the mine gates, Shin urges the group to move quickly. Miss Mu plants explosives to blast the gates open, causing Shen, Milan, Situ, and Guixing to get separated. Guixing sees this as an opportunity to carry out Li's secret orders to kill Situ. However, during the attempt, Guixing discovers that Situ, like Shen, is a vampire. A brief struggle ensues, leaving Guixing dead. When Li finds Guixing's body, he breaks down, calling Shun and Situ monsters despite having been the one who initially plotted to betray them. The group presses forward but loses their way. Milan uses her extraordinary hearing to locate the next exit, but they encounter more soldiers along the path. Situ uses his vampiric speed to take them down. Shen insists on staying behind to delay the soldiers, ordering Milan and Situ to continue. Surprisingly, Li chooses to stay with Shen, explaining that Milan and Situ only see him as a potential food source. Though Li resents Shen for not saving his dying sister, he sees Shen as the only one kind enough to trust in this desperate moment. Soldiers soon overwhelm them, and Miss Mu arrives, capturing Shen while leaving Li behind to die. Alone and injured, Li recalls Guixing's loyalty and the promise he made to Miss Jean to return to her. Meanwhile, Milan and Sidhu find an exit. Sidhu urges Milan to leave as it's what Shen would want, but Milan refuses to abandon him. She returns to confront Miss Mu, who holds Shen captive. Taking advantage of the chaos, Shen uses a flamethrower to kill Miss Mu. Superintendent Wu, seeking to end the matter once and for all, detonates the explosives. However, Shen, Milan, and Sidhu manage to escape the collapsing mine just in time. The next morning, Miss Jin's scheming uncle seizes the opportunity created by Superintendent Chi's death. Manipulating Miss Jin's panic over Lee's disappearance, he tricks her into signing over control of her family's business and assets. Once he becomes the new owner, Miss Jin rushes to Lee's house but finds it empty. Searching his desk, she finds an old photograph of them together, bringing her to tears. Back at the Shin mansion, Shin's injuries heal unusually slowly, worrying Milan. Meanwhile, Mr. Mo enters Miss Mu's house, seizing the third profound stone that her family had stolen from them centuries ago. After 5 days, Shin wakes up completely healed. As he reads old newspapers to catch up on the events that transpired during his recovery, Milan watches him intently, unable to take her eyes off him, clearly relieved and comforted by his recovery. Meanwhile, Miss Jean, deeply worried about Lee, plans to meet the new superintendent to inquire about his whereabouts. However, before she can act, she encounters her cunning uncle, who smugly informs her that he has taken ownership of her family business and property through deceit. Though seething with anger, Miss Jean outwardly accepts the reality without expressing her frustration, choosing to focus on more immediate concerns. While sitting alone on a bench, lost in thought, Miss Jean meets Sidhu. To her surprise, he offers her the keys to his house and invites her to stay there. Concerned about Lee, she asks what happened between him and Shen. Sidhu, avoiding specifics, admits that things were cooperative at first, but unexpected events disrupted their plans. Later, Sidhu visits Shen to discuss Miss Jin's situation. He informs Shen that he found Miss Jean homeless and brought her to his house. Seeking advice, he asks Shen how he might ease her sadness. Milan, observing the conversation, suggests that Shen give Sidhu some money to treat Miss Jean. As they step outside, Shen cryptically tells Sidhu to take care of Milan in the future, hinting at his own declining strength. That night, Miss Jean wakes up from a horrific dream. Seeking comfort, she heads to the washroom. While searching the wardrobe for something to wear, she discovers a secret door leading to another room. Inside, she finds an eerie collection of weapons and bloodstains, hinting at something sinister. Alarmed, she immediately tries to leave the house. Sidhu returns home to find the door to his secret room open and Miss Jean gone. Realizing she has discovered his secret, he quickly tracks her down. Miss Jean, terrified, flees into the streets, asking strangers for help. Sidhu appears, pretending to act calm and innocent, trying to reassure her. However, she is too frightened and runs further away from him. Though Sidhu could easily catch her if he wanted to, he hesitates, as he seems torn between his darker nature and his genuine concern for Miss Jean. After running barefoot through the streets, Miss Jean injures her feet, which deeply worries Sidhu. Despite her fear, he gently insists he is not a monster and would never hurt her. Miss Jean, still terrified, demands he leave her alone. However, Sidhu carries her back to his home, tending to her wounds. When she questions what he truly is, he reluctantly reveals the truth. He is a little bit stronger than humans and requires blood to survive. He reassures her he has never intended to harm her, though Miss Jean remains furious over his deception. Realizing that Sidhu might know Lee's whereabouts, Miss Jean begins to cooperate with him. She decides to use her wits, attempting to seduce him to uncover Lee's fate. Offering him a drink, she feigns friendliness. Though suspicious of her sudden change in behavior, Sidhu plays along. After drinking, he falls unconscious and wakes up to find himself in bed with Miss Jean pointing a sharp knife at him. Miss Jean demands he reveal what happened to Lee. Sidhu swears he didn't kill him, but she refuses to believe him, striking him with the knife. To her shock, his wounds heal instantly. Frustrated, Sidhu admits that Lee is already gone and insists it's futile to search for him anymore. At the same time, it is revealed that Miss Mu survived and has Lee in her custody. The next morning, Miss Jean visits the army headquarters to meet with the new superintendent, Mr. Wu. She pleads for help to recover Lee's body from the collapsed mine so she can give him a proper burial. However, Mr. Wu claims that his men have already searched the mine and found no sign of Lee's body. Devastated, Miss Jean breaks down outside. When Sidhu arrives, she suddenly realizes that if no body was found, Lee might still be alive. Her unwavering devotion to Lee puzzles Sidhu, prompting him to visit Shen and seek answers about love and its meaning. Meanwhile, Milan, feeling confined in Shen's mansion, longs for a normal life. Shin notices it and decides to send her to a lively market, where she can enjoy delicious food and watch street performers. However, Miss Mu, intrigued by Milan's superhuman abilities during their escape from the mines, begins secretly observing her. Suspecting that Milan's enhanced sight and strength are connected to the blood amber stone, Miss Mu sets her sights on Milan. Later, Situ takes Miss Jean to the office building her uncle had stolen from her. Terrified of Situ, her uncle hurriedly returns her property and apologizes, claiming his actions were a joke. That evening, on New Year's Eve, the Shen mansion is beautifully decorated. Situ brings Miss Jean to celebrate with them since she has no one else. Together, they prepare dumplings and enjoy a warm, festive atmosphere. Shen's manager also arrives, and Shen makes an important decision. He declares Milan his successor, entrusting her with his legacy. He also transfers the shares of his newspaper agency to his manager, under the condition that the manager and his descendants must always care for Milan. Later, Shen and Milan share a quiet moment, watching the fireworks light up the night sky. The next morning, Milan returns to her family home, the Mi Mansion. There, she finds an old doll that once comforted her during her difficult times. Feeling nostalgic, she falls asleep but is awoken by strange noises coming from the hallway. Curious, she investigates and discovers her cruel mother eating in the dining room. Her mother, noticing Milan's restored sight and good health, becomes consumed with jealousy and begins hurling insults at Shen. When her mother throws tea at her in a fit of rage, Milan's patience snaps, and she prepares to retaliate. Before she can act, Shen arrives, stopping her just in time. His calm presence diffuses the situation. Shen, seeing Mrs. Mi's bitterness toward Milan, patiently convinces her to reconcile with her daughter. He explains how Milan has endured a lonely life and needs her mother's kindness. His words deeply affect Mrs. Mi, who agrees to make amends. The next morning, Shen and Milan prepare dumplings, and Shen urges her to take some to her mother at the Mi mansion. Milan reluctantly agrees, still harboring resentment. When she arrives, Mrs. Mi initially struggles to accept the offering. However, as they talk, Mrs. Mi breaks down, admitting how her circumstances forced her to lash out at Milan. Touched but conflicted, Milan begins to forgive her. Their fragile reconciliation is interrupted when Miss Mu arrives. Shocked to see her alive, Milan immediately sends her mother upstairs for safety. Milan confronts Miss Mu, who uses the fantasy stone to trap Milan in a web of illusions, incapacitating her. Miss Mu then abducts Milan and takes her back to the mines. At the mines, Miss Mu demands the location of the blood amber stone. When Milan refuses, Miss Mu reveals Li, whose mind has been warped by the fantasy stone. Under its spell, Li is prepared to fight Milan to the death if she does not comply. Meanwhile, Shen learns from Mrs. Mi about a strange woman with a ring taking Milan. Shen investigates Miss Mu's previous hideout and discovers an old Mu family diary. As Milan desperately tries to break through Li's illusions, Miss Mu discovers the blood amber stone hidden on Milan. She seizes it, merges it with a fantasy stone, and gains immense power, achieving immortality. She escapes on a ship, taking Milan hostage. With her prisoners freed, chaos erupts as they roam the city, attacking civilians. Situ, knowing Miss Jin's safety is paramount, insists she remain in his house, promising to find Li. He then joins Shen and Mr. Mo, who has crucial knowledge of Miss Mu's destination. The trio rides through the city on horseback, determined to stop her. At a volcanic site, they confront Miss Mu. Despite their combined strength, her newfound powers render her nearly unstoppable. Then Li also shows up there. As the volcano erupts, the commotion jogs Li's suppressed memories. He recalls his loyal days serving Shen and, in a final act of redemption, sacrifices himself to save Shen from a deadly fireball. Miss Mu targets Shen and Situ, but Mr. Mo steps in, shielding them with the last remnants of his power. Using the profound energy of the stones, he empowers Shen, who strikes the final blow, ending Miss Mu's life and scattering the stone's power. Shen then races to find Milan, discovering her locked inside a box aboard the ship. As he attempts to steer the ship back to the city, a surviving soldier detonates explosives. Shen shields Milan, and they barely survive the explosion, washing ashore. Back in the city, Situ returns to Miss Jean, guilt-ridden for failing to save Li. Though saddened, Miss Jean is relieved that Situ returns safely, showing her growing affection for him. Meanwhile, Shen, weakened and aware of his limited time, urges Milan to embrace life beyond him. He makes her promise to become a musician, explore the world, and find happiness with Situ. Milan, devastated by the thought of parting from Shen, tearfully agrees. As dawn breaks, Shen and Milan share a quiet farewell, their bond unbroken yet destined to diverge. Though their paths now lead in different directions, the memory of their shared journey will forever remain in their hearts. Thank you all for following along with this story.